In 1942, British railways were breaking under the weight of war. Bombing had wrecked locomotives faster than anyone could replace them, and every factory that could build new engines was already making tanks and aircraft parts. So the War Department turned to the only option left, the factory floors of America. What arrived in South Wales were 800 locomotives that British railwaymen dismissed as crude, noisy, and dangerously built. But those machines would haul the supplies that made D-Day possible, spread across 4 continents, and quietly change the way Britain designed its own engines forever. The locomotive that would cross the ocean had a family tree stretching back to the First World War. In 1917, the American Locomotive Company built a fleet of 2 80 freight engines for the United States Army campaign in France. Soldiers called them Pershing engines, named after General John Black Jack Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. Those engines earned a reputation for toughness in the mud and wreckage of the Western Front, hauling ammunition and supplies where nothing else could move. By the 1930s, as war clouds gathered again over Europe, the United States Army Transportation Corps pulled the Pershing design off the shelf and began updating it. The first revision, the S-159, was a cautious modernization. Only 8 were built by Lima Locomotive Works in 1942. But the real breakthrough came next. Before the United States had even entered the war, President Roosevelt's government approved the Lend-Lease supply of a different locomotive to Britain, the S-200 class. These were 282 Mikado types, specifically designed to fit the restricted British loading gauge, and they served with the British Army in the Middle East from 1941 onward. In many ways, the S-200 was a dress rehearsal, proof that American builders could produce engines sized for British and European railways. Lessons from that project fed directly into what came next. Major J.W. Marsh, from the Railway Branch of the Corps of Engineers, led a design committee that included engineers from all 3 of America's great locomotive builders, Baldwin, the American Locomotive Company, and Lima. Their task was specific: build a locomotive strong enough to haul heavy military freight, simple enough for rapid mass production, and small enough to fit through the tunnels and under the bridges of the British loading gauge. That last requirement was critical. British railways ran tighter clearances than American lines. A locomotive that scraped a tunnel wall or clipped a platform edge was useless. The result was the S-160, a locomotive descended from a First World War design, updated by committee, and built to be disposable. Could it really handle the demands of a railway system as exacting as Britain's? Compared to its Pershing ancestor, the S-160 carried a higher-mounted boiler with a larger firebox, expanding the grate area from 32 to 41 square feet. It ran at 225 pounds of steam pressure, up from the Pershing's 190, and produced 31,490 pounds of tractive effort through 19-inch cylinders driving wheels that stood just 4 feet 9 inches tall. But here is where the S-160 revealed its true identity. This was not a locomotive built to last. It was a locomotive built to arrive. The design prioritized speed of construction over durability. Rolled steel plates replaced time-consuming castings wherever possible. Frames were cast steel, or in some cases flame cut from thick steel slabs. Grease lubricators replaced oil-fed systems on the axle boxes. Every shortcut that could shave days off the production schedule was taken deliberately and without apology. Between 1942 and 1946, all 3 builders churned out S-160s at an astonishing pace. Alco produced 755, Baldwin built 712, and Lima contributed 653. The total came to 2,120 locomotives, all built to shared blueprints, interchangeable down to the last bolt, and sized to fit inside the cargo hold of a transport ship. That is when they started arriving in Britain. The first S-160s landed in South Wales and were dispatched from the Great Western Railway's locomotive depot at Ebw Junction in Newport. The earliest 43 units traveled north to the London and Northeastern Railway works at Doncaster, where British engineers got their first close look at what America had sent them. They were not impressed. These locomotives lacked the refinement that British engineers prized. Rough in finish, loud in operation, the rod bearings clattered with enough noise to earn the S-160s their first nickname on British soil, rattlesnakes. And because the machines were stripped of all non-essential components, railwaymen gave them another name borrowed from the famous American burlesque dancer, Gypsy Rose Lee. Soldiers, meanwhile, simply called them GI consolidations, the foot soldiers of the Railway War. But British skepticism went deeper than cosmetics. Braking was, by British standards, woefully poor. The Westinghouse steam brake suffered from a long distance between the driver's valve and the brake cylinder, creating a dangerous lag. Axle box grease lubricators ran hot with alarming regularity, especially when maintenance schedules slipped under the pressure of wartime operations. And the wheel flanges were thinner than British practice demanded, causing the wheels to occasionally pick points on tight radius curves, particularly when running tender first. The most dangerous problem, though, was invisible until it turned catastrophic. Each S-160 carried a single water gauge of a Klinger design, unfamiliar to British crews. If the valves were not opened slowly and fully, the check valves would trap water in the gauge, giving a false reading that showed adequate water levels even as the firebox crown ran dangerously dry. When the crown sheet overheated, the stay bolts holding it in place would fail with almost no warning. In a span of just 10 months, 3 British-operated S-160s suffered firebox crown collapses. GWR locomotive number 2403 was first, in November 1943. Its fireman was killed. A second explosion hit number 2363 on January 12, 1944, while hauling a goods train from Ipswich to Whitemore. On that occasion, the driver suffered a broken leg when the firebox door blew off its hinges, and the fireman was thrown from the footplate. Number 1707 made it 3 when it exploded inside South Harrow Tunnel on August 30th, 1944, pulling freight from Neasden to Woodford. So why did Britain keep using them? Because for all their faults, the S-160 engines could do one thing brilliantly. They could haul freight. These were strong, free-steaming machines that could move enormous loads across damaged track without complaint. The independent springing of the front and rear driving axles, designed to handle the wrecked rail beds of occupied Europe, gave them a stability on rough British wartime track that surprised everyone. Coal or oil, either fuel worked. The engines could operate at elevations up to 6,800 feet, and they were available in numbers that no British builder could match. When it came time to divide the first 400 among the Big Four, the Great Western Railway took 174. The LNER absorbed 168, the LMS received 50, and the Southern Railway, with its shorter routes and lighter traffic, took just 6. Together, those engines filled gaps left by damaged British stock and freed domestic locomotives for other duties. The LNER concentrated its S-160 engines at 6 locomotive sheds rather than spreading them across the entire network. March Depot in Cambridgeshire received the largest allocation with 50 engines. 25 went to Woodford for the Great Central section. Stratford took 21. 2 sheds in the northeastern section, Heaton and Neville Hill, each received 25, and the remaining 22 went to St. Margaret's in Scotland. The Neville Hill engines had a habit of wandering far from home, turning up as far north as Edinburgh and as far south as Hitchin. How did British crews feel about working with these unfamiliar machines day after day? While in LNER ownership, the S-160 engines wore a distinctive livery of matte light gray with silver lettering and numbers. The tenders read USA at first, with Transportation Corps added later. One engine, number 2373, was painted in gloss black for a press exhibition, a rare moment of polish for a machine designed to avoid exactly that kind of attention. The Southern Railway's allocation was so small for a practical reason. Wartime traffic on Southern metals had already forced the loan of 20 King Arthur Class 460s from the GDWR and another 10 from the LNER. Once enough S-160 engines reached traffic, those borrowed engines were returned to their home railways. All 4 companies put the S-160s to heavy work. They hauled military supplies, ammunition, and troops toward the south coast of England in the massive build-up to the Normandy invasion. But these 400 engines were only half the story. The second batch of 400 S-160s never entered regular British service at all. They were prepared by American military personnel at Eby W Junction, greased, camouflaged, and stored at locations across South Wales, hidden from Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that regularly scanned the Welsh coast. Row after row of grey locomotives sat under camouflage netting in railway sidings and goods yards, waiting in silence for the order that would send them across the English Channel. They waited there for months, still and ready for the invasion of Europe. If you are finding this useful, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this one every week, the railway history that rarely gets told. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment. 400. American-built locomotives, parked quietly in the Welsh hills, each one a piece of an invasion plan so vast that it required a fleet of machines just to keep it supplied with fuel and ammunition. The S-160s were not fighting machines. They would never fire a shot or carry a soldier into battle. But without them, the armies that landed on the beaches of Normandy would have had no supply chain behind them. But not all of them made it across the Atlantic safely. In April 1943, German U-boats attacked 2 convoy ships carrying S-160 locomotives. The SS Pacific Grove was torpedoed on April 12th, southeast of Cape Farewell, Greenland. A week later, on April 19th, the Robert Gray went down in the middle of the North Atlantic. 6 locomotives were lost to the ocean floor, swallowed by the same war they were built to help win. After the D-Day invasion of Normandy, on June 6, 1944, everything moved fast. The S-160s stored in Wales were prepared, loaded onto transport ships, and sent to France. Then the locomotives, still on loan to the Big Four, were returned to the U.S. Army Transportation Corps and shipped across the English Channel. By September 1944, the LNER had lost nearly all of its S-160 allocation. The machines followed the advancing Allied armies eastward, hauling supplies on the rebuilt rail lines behind the front. But the S-160 story did not end in France. While British-based engines crossed the Channel, other S-160s had already been at work in North Africa, arriving with General Patton's forces during Operation Torch. As the campaign moved north through Tunisia and into Italy, the locomotives followed. The Italian State Railway eventually absorbed 243 of them, designating the class FS 736. After the war ended, the S-160s scattered across the globe like seeds from a broken pod. The scale of distribution was staggering. Over 500 went to Hungary, where they were classified as the 411 series, though 26 of those were stripped for spare parts before they ever turned a wheel. Significant numbers landed in France, where SNCF designated them 230G. Yugoslavia, Poland, and the Soviet Union all received large allocations. Poland alone took more than 500, classified as TR-201 and TR-203, and Polish railways reduced the boiler pressure to 190 pounds per square inch and limited maximum speed to 40 miles per hour. The Poles added electric headlights, cab side doors, and modified the piston valves, adapting the American design to local conditions and keeping them running for decades. How far could a single locomotive design stretch? In the East, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration shipped S-160s to China and South Korea. The Chinese classified them as KD-6, and many were modernized with larger cabs, taller smokestacks, and horizontal smoke lifters. They were eventually transferred to industrial coal mines, far from the European battlefields they were designed for. 60 were sent to India in kit form, converted from standard to broad gauge and assembled locally, split between the East Indian Railway and the South Indian Railway. A dozen worked the Alaska Railroad in the United States itself, hauling freight through some of the most remote terrain in North America. 2 went to Peru, 10 went to Mexico. 200 were converted to the broader Russian gauge for the Soviet railways, and some of those eventually ended up on Sakhalin Island, in the far east of Siberia. But one of the war's stranger ironies was still waiting. During the Korean War, S-160 locomotives served on both sides of the conflict. North Korean forces operated engines that had arrived through the Soviet Union and China. South Korean forces ran 100 units on the Korean National Railroad, classified as the Sori II class. But there was a catch. The S-160 was right-hand drive, built for a right-running railway. Korea ran its trains on the left. Every South Korean crew operating an S-160 was sitting on the wrong side of the cab, peering across the footplate for signals. The same American locomotive, designed for a European war, found itself hauling military cargo for opposing armies on the same peninsula and confusing crews on both sides in different ways. The last operational S-160 is believed to have been KD-6, number 487, withdrawn in China around 1997. A locomotive designed to last maybe 5 years had survived for more than half a century. But perhaps the most unexpected chapter in the S-160 story played out not on some distant railway, but back in Britain, inside the drawing offices of the men who had once dismissed these machines as crude. After the war, when British engineers sat down to design the new British Railways Standard Class locomotives, features that had first appeared on the S-160 showed up in the blueprints. Rocking grates, which allowed crews to break up clinker without stopping the engine. Hopper ash pans, which made disposal faster and cleaner. Grease lubrication for the motion, once mocked as a cost-cutting compromise, proved to be practical and reliable. The innovations that British railwaymen had criticized in 1942 became standard equipment on British locomotives built in the 1950s. What had arrived as a temporary solution, a wartime stopgap built by foreigners who supposedly did not understand how proper locomotives should be made, left behind a technical legacy that outlived steam itself. So what happened to the machines themselves? Today, at least 26 S-160s survive in preservation, scattered across Greece, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, and Italy. One of the most famous is number 5820, built by Lima of Ohio in 1945 and shipped to Poland for post-war reconstruction. In 1977, the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway negotiated its purchase from Polish state railways, no small feat during the Cold War. The locomotive arrived at Haworth in November of that year, still carrying its Polish livery as TR-203-474. A year later, Keighley Station and Engine 5820 were chosen to appear in the film Yanks. It was a fitting role. Several hundred S-160s had worked through that very station during the D-Day preparations of 1943 and 1944. There is something worth sitting with in this story. Britain's railways were built on a tradition of precision, of craftsmanship, of engines designed to last generations. The S-160 was none of those things by intention. Rough, utilitarian, built for a world on fire. And yet, it worked. Those engines hauled the supplies that kept an invasion on schedule. They ran on 6 continents and served railways that had nothing else left. And when the engineers who had dismissed it finally looked past the rattling bearings and the rough finish, they found ideas worth keeping. Sometimes the machines that change everything are not the ones we admire. They are the ones we need.